Sometimes a nation, like a person, comes to a moment when it must decide what kind of future it will live for. The American Civil War was one of those moments, a time when questions of freedom, justice, and unity could no longer be set aside. It was a struggle that tore families apart, tested courage in ways few could imagine, and forever changed the story of a country searching for its true identity. The American Civil War began with a struggle over ideas that were much larger than any one person or state. At its heart, the cause of the war was about slavery and freedom. For many years, the United States had been divided between states that allowed slavery and those that did not. In the South, enslaved people were forced to work on plantations, treated as property rather than human beings. In the North, many believed slavery was wrong and should not expand into new lands as the country grew westward. These disagreements created growing tension. Alongside the issue of slavery, there was also the question of states' rights. Some Southern leaders argued that each state had the power to make its own laws, even if that meant continuing slavery. They feared the federal government was becoming too strong and that it would threaten their way of life. For the North, preserving the Union was just as important as ending the spread of slavery. The more these two sides argued, the more divided the country became, until compromise was no longer possible. By the 1860 election, when Abraham Lincoln was chosen as president, many Southern states felt his leadership threatened their control over slavery. In their anger and fear, they decided to leave the Union and form their own government, the Confederacy. This act of secession made the conflict unavoidable. What began as a political disagreement over freedom and control grew into a fight that touched every community in America. Families were split apart in their beliefs, neighbors argued, and the nation itself stood on the edge of breaking. The causes of the Civil War remind us how powerful ideas about justice, freedom, and human dignity can be, and how disagreements about them can shape the destiny of a whole nation. The beginning of the Civil War was sudden, yet it had been building for many years through arguments and divisions. When the Southern states seceded from the Union, tension reached a breaking point. In April 1861, the very first shots of the war were fired at Fort Sumter, a Union fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Confederate forces demanded that the fort surrender, but the Union troops refused. After hours of bombardment, the fort finally gave way, and with that event, the war had officially begun. What followed was a wave of uncertainty across the nation. Men rushed to enlist, some with excitement and a sense of duty, others with quiet fear in their hearts. Families said goodbye at train stations and doorsteps, not knowing if they would ever see their loved ones again. In both the North and the South, people believed the war might be short, over in just a few months. But as more battles unfolded, it became clear this would be a long and painful struggle. Communities changed overnight. Fields once full of crops turned into training grounds for soldiers. Cities and towns became supply centers and hospitals. Newspapers spread news of victories and losses, and every headline carried the weight of hope or sorrow. The start of the war also meant that neighbors could suddenly become enemies, divided not just by geography but by beliefs about freedom, loyalty, and the future of the country. What began at Fort Sumter set in motion a conflict that no one could easily stop. The beginning of the Civil War was not only the clash of cannons and muskets, but also the clash of ideals that had lived inside the hearts of Americans for decades. Life during the Civil War was filled with hardship, uncertainty, and sacrifice for both soldiers and the families they left behind. For the men who marched into battle, daily life was often exhausting. They faced long marches in rough weather, sleeping outdoors with little shelter, and eating rations that were plain and sometimes scarce. Illness spread quickly through crowded camps, and more soldiers died from disease than from bullets. Letters from home became lifelines, carrying words of comfort, encouragement, and love across miles of separation. For the families who stayed behind, life also changed in countless ways. Wives, mothers, and children were left to manage farms, businesses, and households on their own. Every day carried the weight of worry, as they waited for news that might bring joy or heartbreak. In the South, shortages of food and supplies became common as the war dragged on, while in the North, families worked tirelessly to send aid to soldiers. Children felt the absence of fathers and brothers, sometimes too young to fully understand why the war was happening, but old enough to feel its sorrow. Communities grew, closer in some ways, sharing resources and comforting one another, but the strain of loss and the fear of what might come next touched every town and every family. Even in moments of rest, soldiers longed for the warmth of home, and families longed for safe returns. The war was fought not only on battlefields, but also in kitchens, fields, and quiet rooms where people prayed for peace. The everyday struggles of soldiers and their loved ones remind us that war is not only about leaders and armies, but about the countless ordinary lives that are changed forever by conflict. The Civil War had several moments that changed its direction and gave new meaning to the sacrifices being made. One of the most important turning points came in 1863 at the Battle of Gettysburg. For 3 days, soldiers fought fiercely on the hills and fields of Pennsylvania, and when the battle ended, the Confederate Army was forced to retreat. It was a heavy loss for the South and gave the North renewed hope that victory was possible. Around the same time, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This declaration freed enslaved people in the states that were still in rebellion and turned the war into a fight not only to preserve the Union but also to bring an end to slavery. It gave courage to those who had long prayed for freedom and allowed African American men to join the Union Army, adding strength to its cause. Another significant moment was the capture of Vicksburg, which gave the Union control of the Mississippi River and divided the Confederacy in two. These events together shifted momentum toward the North. They showed that the war would not be decided quickly or easily, but that determination, courage, and vision could change the course of history. The turning points also carried emotional weight, reminding both soldiers and civilians that the struggle was not only about land or power, but about the very meaning of the nation. The victories came with enormous cost in lives lost, yet they offered a sense of purpose and direction that guided the Union through the darkest days of conflict. These moments stand as reminders of how a single battle, a bold decision, or a change in spirit can transform the path of an entire people. By 1865, the Civil War was drawing to its close, but not without great suffering and sacrifice. The Confederate armies were growing weaker, supplies were scarce, and the Union forces had gained strength and determination. General Ulysses S. Grant pressed hard against Confederate forces in Virginia, while General William Tecumseh Sherman marched through the South, leaving behind a trail that broke the Confederacy's ability to sustain the fight. Towns and farmlands were scarred by battles, and ordinary people carried the heavy weight of destruction. Finally, in April of that year, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The meeting was quiet and respectful, a simple exchange that marked the end of 4 years of bloodshed. The surrender brought a sense of relief across the nation, though not all wounds could be healed so easily. The abolition of slavery became one of the most powerful results of the war, and with it came both hope and challenge. Millions of formerly enslaved men, women, and children stepped into freedom, facing an uncertain future in a land that had long denied them their rights. For many families, reunion was bittersweet, as loved ones returned scarred by war or never returned at all. The war had ended, but the nation's journey of rebuilding was only beginning. Reconstruction would be a time of struggle, progress, and resistance, as America worked to define what freedom and equality truly meant. The end of the Civil War was not only the close of battles, but also the beginning of a new chapter, one where the sacrifices of so many demanded that the country strive to become something greater than it had ever been before. The legacy of the Civil War reaches far beyond the years in which it was fought. It remains one of the most defining chapters in American history, shaping the country in ways that can still be felt today. The abolition of slavery was its most significant outcome, opening the door to freedom for millions of people who had been denied even the most basic human rights. Yet freedom did not mean equality, and the years after the war brought their own struggles as formerly enslaved people sought to build lives of dignity amid continuing prejudice and hardship. The war also left a legacy of unity and division, for while the Union was preserved, the scars of bitterness and loss lingered across generations. Families who had lost fathers, sons, and brothers carried their grief long after the cannons fell silent. Communities rebuilt, but reminders of the conflict could be found in empty chairs at dinner tables, in battlefields turned into quiet memorials, and in the stories passed down from those who lived through it. At the same time, the war showed the strength of resilience and the power of ideals. It proved that a nation could endure even the most painful test if its people held fast to the vision of justice and unity. The lessons of sacrifice, courage, and the ongoing pursuit of equality became woven into the American identity. Monuments, songs, and writings kept alive the memory of those who fought and died, serving as reminders of both the cost of division and the hope of reconciliation. The Civil War's legacy is not only about the past, but also about the responsibility each generation carries to learn from it, to continue building a nation where freedom and equality belong to all. The story of the American Civil War is more than a tale of battles and leaders. It is the story of a nation struggling to define itself, of people wrestling with questions of freedom, justice, and unity. It reminds us that conflict is not only fought on fields with soldiers, but also in hearts and homes where families bear the weight of choices and consequences. Out of pain and loss came the end of slavery, a step toward the promise that all people are created equal, even though the road to true equality would remain long and difficult. The war left behind grief and division, yet it also planted seeds of hope, courage, and resilience that continue to shape the United States. Its legacy calls us to remember the sacrifices made and to honor them by striving for understanding, compassion, and fairness in our own time. The Civil War shows us how fragile unity can be, but also how strong a nation can become when it seeks to uphold justice and freedom for all its people.